extraordinary things that happened during the course of that, like this judgment against Andy Coulson when he was editor of the News of the World, with an £800,000 payout for bullying against the man who was about to walk through the doors of Downing Street and become press officer to the Prime Minister. Not one paper covered that. You imagine if that had been Alistair Campbell. So there was this sort of omerta about this story, which is why I went to the New York Times to get the New York Times involved. And so we can throw rotten apples at the Select Committee, but actually the Select Committee has, I think, restored to some extent the reputation of Parliament. And you can say they were posturing or whatever, but they did patiently try and dig out this story in a way that the press wouldn't. So I don't think the press has got anything to boast about in this story, or to say that Parliament is self-regarding. Actually, Parliament did, some might think, a rather better job than many people in the press.
Well, I agree with you absolutely about the papers. I didn't really ask you about the papers. I agree that the papers didn't follow the original story, let alone what the Select Committee then did. And as you said, for 18 months it set the tone. Mm-hmm. But I was just saying, I just feel, perhaps this is just my view, I'd be interested if anybody wants to ask afterwards or comment afterwards, that the Select Committee has become a sort of self-perpetuating, I don't know, miserable old uncle, but you can't say that about some of them, who feel that they know about this, and they're becoming, it's almost as though they're building a reputation on something that they don't fully understand, and I think that when the report came out, weren't very pleased. It was a pretty botched report.
Well, actually, I think the critique of the Select Committee's system, my critique would be different. It would be that they're not powerful enough, and I mean, when you see someone like Robert Jay, with all the evidence that Leveson has called in, this 1,000 text messages between Fred Michel and Adam Smith, the ability to call in evidence and say, we are going to get to the bottom of this, is quite remarkable. And we've learned a huge amount about British public life in the last 9 months, which is why I think Leveson has been a good thing. And actually the Select Committee, I mean, I agree that some of their questioning was a bit amateurish. It was not very penetrating, not very forensic. But my response to that would be to give them someone like Robert Jay. So it was more like the American system of congressional committees, so that Parliament was back in the driving seat, which in a democracy is where I think it should be. And we can argue about whether Tom Watson and Louise Mensch, had an undignified standoff at the end, and whether they should have pressed the division on the issue of whether James Murdoch was fit and proper. But I think the Select Committee did not a bad job in the circumstances.
I meant to mention earlier, but I will now, that the BGI ran a piece supporting a conscience clause. This is going back to really the journalist on the shop floor in the newsroom. I think that's something you support. I mean, it could work both ways, couldn't it? In that obviously journalists could, with the conscience clause written into their contract, refuse to do something they thought was unethical, but they could also, in reverse, say, well, why don't you publish this story in a situation like you've just been describing?
Yes, again, one of the interesting things in Leveson was the NU jail there, in Leveson, not necessarily in News International, I think what Leveson has been missing, and maybe it comes back to your first question about whether Leveson's been completely fair to the journalistic body. We have missed the voice of everyday reporters a bit, but that also does come down to the fear factor. It's strange that the only reporter I think we have heard from is Richard Peppiatt, the guy sacked from the Daily Star. And then you had Michel Stanistreet on behalf of the NUJ saying, well, we have taken evidence from 35 reporters over there who are too frightened to come and give you evidence because these are very powerful beasts still. But what they would say is X, Y, and Z, and it wasn't a very pretty picture. So I completely support some kind of conscience clause where people can say, I don't believe you should be asking me to do that. It's not it's against the PCC code, it's against the NUJ code.
Or against the law, indeed.
Or against the law, and I ought to also have some protection if I want to speak out about that. Again, it happens in other industries.
Okay, I think we should perhaps just move on because otherwise the entire talk will be about that subject, about open journalism. You've said open journalism is journalism which is fully knitted into the web of information. I could read the entire quote, but tell us the vision of yours for open journalism.
Well, the way I describe open journalism, forgive me if anybody's heard this before, the simplest way I describe what I mean is to take the theatre critic. Michael Billington, wonderful theatre critic, he's been writing for The Guardian since 1971. So he is, in the sort of 19th and 20th century concept of the press, he is the authority figure. So, I'm going to keep Michael Billington for as long as he wants to write. If you ask any audience like this, you say, what about the other 800 people in the stalls on the same night as Michael Billington? Is it conceivable that they've got nothing interesting to say about the performance? The obvious answer is, well, of course they have. Would you get a better account of that play if you encouraged the people in the audience to say something? The answer has to be yes. So that's open journalism. So if you followed me that far, you're on the side of open journalism. So then there are two obvious questions. One is, out of, you've got 800 in the audience, probably 60 can be bothered to write on that night, though the show might go on for months. Out of those, probably 5 will be any good. So how do you select the 5? But there will be 5 people in the audience who are really knowledgeable and passionate about the theatre and who would add something. So that's the first question, which is about editing. And it's the same problem that Amazon and virtually everybody who goes in for social media is faced with. And the second question is, okay, if that works for culture, does it work for sport, investigations, foreign reporting, science, environment, all the things that we cover? And the answer is always yes, in my experience. And so, are you doing something that is journalistically better by embracing that? I think the answer is yes. Is it in the long road going to be commercially better? Well, I think the answer is also yes, because if you close yourself to all that, somebody else is going to do it in an open way, and then you're going to be balancing your Billington against the 800, and it's not clear to me which would win out of that. So that's what I mean by open journalism.
Okay, but in terms of the social media that you just mentioned, you told a Harvard audience, we love the fact that since launching on Facebook, we've acquired 4 million additional active users, half of whom are under 25. But you continued, it doesn't translate into instant cash any more than it does for Twitter or for Facebook. No. So it's the question that we've talked about before, and you're asked it all the time. How do you translate it into making enough money to keep the entire operation going?
Yeah. Well, this is an incredibly difficult period for all newspapers. So people look at The Guardian and say you're loss-making. Well, in the last 2 years, we've lost about half the losses of the Times and Sunday Times. Yevgeny Lebedev stood up and said the serious end of the British press are losing. The Times, Independent, Guardian losing 100 million a year. He's lost personally 75 million since he bought the Stand and the Independent. The same is true if you look in Europe, if you look in America. This is a period of transition. And the dilemma for all of us is, do you put your main resource, energy, and skill set into producing the papers, which we're all in lockstep. We're all going down at about 10% a year. So there's not too many years of 10% loss in print in which you can sail on like that. And that doesn't matter whether you have a paywall or you're completely free. It seems to have no effect on print at all in Britain. Or do you say it's pretty obvious that some form of digital distribution is going to be the future, and you would rather get ahead of the curve, get the audience, understand what that is, get the skill set, because on that survival depends. And you will never get an audience to agree on that, and I won't get the Guardian staff to agree on that, and there are members of the Guardian staff who would much rather that I thought much more about print. And there are some people who think I'm hopelessly old-fashioned and we should be doing much more on digital. But that is the dilemma, and that's the dilemma we all face. And it's not an easy one. I would say it's a more difficult dilemma facing the present generation than since the abolition of the stamp tax. I mean, I think, you know, it's a very big question that we all face.
But the obvious one is to go is through electronic publishing through the web. You make good income, which the Mail appears to be doing with, interestingly, a website that is very different, in some ways, very different to the paper. I mean, there's got to be a way, that seems to be the way, is there?
Well, the Mail has exactly the identical business model to the one we have. And we're making good income too. I mean, 25% of our income is now on digital. That's about 50 million a year. So, you know, God help us if we weren't as energetic and aggressive in doing this. But, you know, I've said for years, you know, the print is going like that. Digital is going like that, and those two lines are not going to meet. And in the middle of that, you know, just to make things even worse, you get the worst recession since the 1920s. Yeah. So it's a very difficult time, and it was always going to be choppy and uncomfortable.
So you may have seen in Monday's Independent, Heather Brooks said that, you know, the Freedom of Information campaign, and she criticised The Guardian for digital first and free, saying it's an unsustainable model to give news away for free because news is not free, it's expensive. I thought the point about that, when I read it, was yes, news is expensive. And if you can't make the sort of money that you really need to keep people in the field, to keep, Alan said broadcasting, but keep great foreign correspondents working, and people out in the field, which The Guardian does very well, you're lost in what you're trying to do. And isn't there a danger that online only, which eventually will become, will lose all that?
Did I see Heather walk in?
No.
No, all right.
I know you can say what you like.
No, it's just, I was just because I would like to discuss it with her, because does she mean, is the criticism that you're digital first, is that the strategic mistake? Is it open? Is it free? You know, in principle,
I think free was the thing that she was most complaining about.
At the moment, we charge for print. Obviously, we charge for the iPhone, we charge for the iPad, we charge for the Kindle, and we're free on the browser. So I think we're charging what the market will take in terms of earning meaningful sums. And we haven't set our face against a New York Times style paywall, though it's not clear to me that that's the silver bullet that's going to produce the salvation of the press either. I'm not entirely clear what Heather's critique was, but you know, we've got some pretty good commercial brains at The Guardian, including Andrew Miller, who's our chief executive, who's probably the only chief executive running a company at the moment in Britain, a media company, who did make the transition from print to digital. He did it with Auto Trader. And so he's no one's fool. And he sits there with people like Neil Burkett, the chief executive of Virgin, on our board, Simon Fox, the chief executive of HMV, Brent Huberman from, you know, and they sit there and they think that actually the commercial strategy we have is the right one. But it's perfectly right to say that nobody from Rupert Murdoch through to who's the opposite of nobody from Rupert Murdoch to Mark Zuckerberg can confidently predict the future more than about 2 years out at the moment. So nobody's got the answer, and I've forgotten what B was.